Principles of parts management. In the broadest terms, the parts department's primary goal is to deliver the right part at the right time at the right price to each customer. Since, as we've observed, the largest part of parts revenue is generated through service department repair orders, customer then here means both internal and external customers. And of course, this goal includes doing this optimally profitably. In this discussion, there are 5 core learning objectives we need to review, which are reflected in the 5 learning outcomes listed here. The first is identify core priorities in balancing service level and inventory investment. It stands to reason the more inventory I have, the better I can serve demand, but that comes at a cost of tying up a lot of capital. Second is define the impact of parts inventory on working capital management. We've said in another context that parts inventory is working capital, and working capital needs to be turned to earn a reasonable return on investment. 3. Examine the key issues affecting inventory management decisions. There are 5 core issues which usually then also translate into 5 core key performance indicators to measure inventory effectiveness, and here we'll talk about the issues first in general terms. Then 4. Evaluate how efficient parts purchasing practices directly affect profitability. Lower the acquisition cost and the cost of purchasing parts, if taking advantage of discounts, etc., that clearly directly affects profitability. And 5, employ professional inventory control and security measures to safeguard the inventory investment. This deals with asset management controls. By way of introduction, I'll start with a couple of basic principles to assure that we all appreciate the context, or fundamentals as they're labeled here. And this will make sure that the terminology used and the concepts discussed mean the same thing to each participant. Now, dealership departments are operated as individual profit centers. So in this setting, revenue flows through net profit, or more precisely in most franchises, financial statements, to operating profit in accordance with the following equation. Sales minus cost of sales equals gross profit minus expenses equals net profit, or as I mentioned, operating profit, depending on the statement. This is an important difference between dealership accounting and the traditional aftermarket. In this setting, expenses do not affect gross profit. According to this basic equation, you could reduce expenses to 0, gross profit would not change. So more on this as this course progresses, because that's a key understanding, dealerships operating departments as specific profit centers. I've made reference in discussing the learning outcomes, or quickly reviewing the learning outcomes, that inventory is working capital. What exactly is working capital? You see here a basic balance sheet structure, and working capital is defined as current assets minus current liabilities. The basic balance sheet shows assets usually and it's typically page 1 of the dealership financial statement. The assets on the left hand side, the liabilities and net worth and equities on the right hand side, current assets towards the top, long-term capital assets and long-term liabilities or debt to the right towards the bottom. And so working capital is current assets minus current liabilities. Current means anything that is converted into cash within 1 year, that's for assets, or reducing cash within 1 year, and that's for liabilities. And working capital is a crucial measure of dealership liquidity. You'll learn more on financial issues in the financial management course of this program, but just to kind of wrap up that discussion of basic balance sheet structure, capital assets, facility equipment, depending on how effectively this facility and equipment is used. For example, if the service department that generates a lot of part sales operates multiple shifts, that falls into the category of or extended hours of operation, or two shifts at least. That's operating leverage, and capital budgeting deals with capital expenditures and capital investments. On the long-term side, long-term debt is notes and bonds, etc., and longer term loans. And what's left between assets and liabilities is equity or net worth, as the more typical term in the dealership statement. Financial leverage is to what extent debt is used to generate income, and cost of financing and cost of capital have to do with capital structure and where the money basically is raised for that. So let's go to an actual simple balance sheet example of the top portion of the balance sheet. On the left hand side, current assets; on the right hand side, current liabilities. And the assets tend to be shown with the more liquid elements, or the ones that consume cash in shorter term, towards the top, and then progressively as we going down to the lower accounts, that's somewhat longer term, but current means within 1 year. Okay, cash, clearly that's the most liquid. That is exactly what drives payments and liquidity. Total receivables. In the typical setting, 30 days, net plus 30 days is sort of the classic receivables collection. Today we see more 60 and 90 days, depending on what the account has essentially as a payment practice. But usually when it gets much beyond 90 days, there's a question on whether it's collectible and ends up as a doubtful account. Total inventories in the dealership setting, new vehicle sales, used vehicle sales are the major portion of that inventory investment. Parts and accessories inventory comes right after that. And then prepaid expenses. They're typically, let's use an example, perhaps something like insurance for the year that is consumed only on a month-by-month basis, and yet we pay it at the beginning of the year. That would be a classic prepaid expense. Bank loan overdraft on the right hand side, and the current liabilities, that would be the line of credit and whatever short term loans are raised. Finance company may be regularly turning over maybe new vehicle sales contracts, etc., that are financed, and accounts payable. It's the equivalent of accounts receivable. Whatever your payment practice is as a dealer, that would be liquidated and consume cash, say, within 30 or 60 days. And then accrued expenses. And accrued expenses would be things like taxes payable, maybe employee source deductions due to Canada Revenue Agency and that kind of thing. They're already incurred, but maybe get paid quarterly or whatever the case may be. So we see then on the left-hand side total current assets, on the right-hand side total current liabilities, and total current liabilities deducted from total current assets. So 5,671,260 minus 4,984,754. That is net working capital. As indicated, working capital is a crucial measure of dealership liquidity. Hopefully this number is a positive number. If not, you are insolvent. Now let me move into the discussion of parts operation issues. We had previously introduced this parts order cycle and walked through the step in general discussion at the introductory stage. So let me get a little more specific about each of these steps. So a part is sold, or there is a lost sale. That is a demand. That's a call on inventory and is a demand. A lost sale could not be filled, meaning if it had been in stock, it probably could have been filled, so it is a demand. Now, demand is inputted into the inventory control system, and parts sales invoice clearly inputs that into the system. For lost sales, there's a separate account in which we accumulate lost sales by part numbers to allow us to track whether a given repetitive lost sale justifies perhaps bringing this part into inventory. Then calculate the stock order. The system uses various buying guides to calculate a stock order, and many of these parameters are user specified or can be user specified. There's clearly an original vendor set up to those, but you can modify that to serve your needs. And then enter the order into the order system, the manufacturer's order system. This in most cases today, and it depends. Some DMS let you download it directly into an order system. Others have to be keyed in. But today, most of the orders are directly entered into the manufacturer's order process via its web portals, and many of the more sophisticated manufacturers let you check live inventory status to ensure you understand is this part likely to be delivered, say, overnight. And then the order is received at the parts distribution center. The order is picked, packed, and shipped, and it is received at the dealership. That's the traditional lead time. And now it is, particularly in a larger dealership where there's constantly parts flowing in and out, it is not necessarily at this point ready to be sold. It has to first be put on the shelf and entered into the system. So when a parts counter person brings up a screen for a given part, then it shows as in inventory and it is ready to be sold. Now, each of these steps take time, clearly, and this is the reason why we need inventory to cover these lag or lead times that I indicated here. Now, the challenge of inventory management is to balance customer satisfaction, usually narrowly defined in the part setting as parts availability, with profit satisfaction. And that requires optimal working capital management. That's what leads a high return on investment to a high profit. This challenge is illustrated, and I'll show it as a inventory balance graphic here. And there are key trade-offs between holding a low inventory or a high inventory. Low inventory, clearly, there will be stockouts and demand that cannot be filled, and that leads usually to low customer satisfaction, or is low customer satisfaction if we define satisfaction as availability. But it is a low inventory investment, less money tied up in inventory, and so therefore better working capital use. But it generates high parts acquisition costs. What usually happens in low inventories, there are more orders being submitted, but these orders tend to be smaller than in a high inventory setting. So they're repetitive orders, and while they may not have a direct cost, they certainly have a cost in terms of manpower, support staff needed to process these orders, etc. So high parts acquisition cost. On the high inventory side, high customer satisfaction, clearly there's better availability, but high inventory investment. A lot of working capital tied up, and unless that clearly moves, it can freeze working capital. And high inventory holding cost, that means as that working capital sits on the shelf and does not turn over, there at minimum some opportunity costs of that capital not being used for other profitable returns. So in other words, inventory availability means not only having the needed items, but to have only what is needed by stocking carefully selected parts in specific quantities for definite periods or defined periods. And this provides the best return on investment. Now, the industry uses one of a choice of three different main categories of order systems. And the first one is an automatic stock replenishment systems. The example of that is the RIM system used by General Motors dealers and was pioneered by Saturn. RIM stands for Retail Inventory Management. and it operates by a General Motors hosted server, which uses specific buying guides to monitor the dealer's inventory movement and automatically generate orders and ship them to the dealer. So the parts manager there does not make the core buying decisions; they are made by the system. Second system, and some kind of open daily order system. It was pioneered by Toyota, and appropriately also the pioneer of just-in-time parts management in a manufacturing setting. And it's this kind of just-in-time system usually allows you to submit any number of orders prior to a daily cutoff time, and it will be delivered overnight by a contracted carrier who has access to a secure drop-off point at the dealership, and the part will be there in the morning. So clearly this is fast turnaround and very short lead times. The third order system, which is the traditional order system, is the weekly stock order system, and one of its key features was that there was a assigned day in the week that dealers can submit their stock order, and that was attractive to the manufacturers or the suppliers on the basis of that then allows them to spread kind of the order flow throughout the week by assigning different days to different groups of dealers, and that spread also the workloads in the parts distribution center. Clearly, if I have a weekly stock order, I've just submitted my weekly stock order and another order comes in 10 minutes later, I have a week now before I can place that on the next stock order. So lead times are longer, and that results also in higher inventory investment. So typically, to make it attractive to the dealer to use this weekly stock order process, a 5% stock order discount was given on those orders placed as a stock order, and a 3% obsolescence allowance, which is kind of a balance that builds up that allows you to return redundant parts without restocking charges. I will discuss the 5 core issues in inventory management in the weekly stock order setting because it lends itself best to explain the key considerations involved. But the core issues, however, apply to all 3 systems. So let me start with explaining some of the issues involved. Stock order purchases result in the most efficient acquisition of parts and maximum dealership earnings of discounts and allowances. In the weekly stock orders setting for sure, because only stock orders earn the purchase discounts and the return allowance. In just-in-time order systems, a return allowance is provided for all purchases, and but no stock order discount. And the RIM system is, as I said, automatic stock replenishment. A balancing act, or the balancing act, is weighing the desire for cost-efficient parts purchasing against the need to meet reasonable customer expectations. If I come back to that example I used a moment ago, if I've just submitted my stock order and say a body shop comes in with a major sheet metal order because it has just received authorization to proceed with a repair from the insurance companies, well, you have a choice. Do I make this a special order now and forego the 5% discount and the 3% obsolescence allowance, or do I wait for a week? And that very much depends on reasonable customer expectations in the setting. Now, here's what we are trying to accomplish under the heading of objectives of inventory management. First is keep the inventory investment within the dealership's fiscal limits to preserve cash flow. Clearly, if the dealership is in a tight liquidity position, then that will affect the parts manager's latitude in buying parts on special discounts in quantity and issues such as that. Second is maintain appropriate balance between customer demand and profit requirement. That's clearly that scale that we showed earlier of inventory balance. To what extent do we serve demand with parts in inventory, and to what extent does it make sense to forego some of the discount because these are parts that are only infrequently being demanded, and therefore it doesn't warrant stocking them. Minimize any losses caused by obsolete inventory. Obsolete inventory is inventory that sits on the shelf and does not move for whatever period of time you use to define an obsolete part. Obsolete inventory freezes working capital and thus reduces return on investment. Next is safeguard against theft, damage, misuse, or waste. This is the classic asset control process, and I'll talk about that towards the end of this particular topic discussion. What are some of the best practices there? Reduce cost of sales and expenses wherever possible. Whatever cost of sales is deducted from sales is my gross profit level, and whatever expenses are deducted from gross profit translates into operating profit, and clearly that requires rigorous management. Increase unit and or dollar sales through merchandising and sales promotion. We've observed on a couple of occasions that a big chunk of the parts department sales are through service department repair orders, so clearly a major issue is cooperation between parts and service that allows special promotional programs and special merchandising and marketing tactics to be implemented, and from wholesales and retail over-the-counter sales are directly under the parts manager's control. So do we, for example, use wholesale salespeople to develop that business? Purchase wisely for the best price or value. That in effect means avail yourself of any available discounts, like seasonal specials that would promotional programs that would typically come with additional discounts, stock order discounts, return allowances, all these kind of things. So purchase wisely for the best price or value. Now this brings us to the first of the 5 issues that I introduced a moment ago, and that is demand forecasting. Knowing what to stock, in essence. Typically, parts demand has a certain profile and is shown here as the life cycle of a part. Now, it may not look exactly that way, but that's kind of a typical pattern. We start, this year is for a period of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, for a period of 5 years. So we have some demand. Let's say a new model is introduced that has some unique new parts that are available or need to be used for service or maintenance. So we have one demand here in February. We have 2 demands in April, 2 pieces demanded in April. We have another demand, single piece demand in June. At what point do we bring this in stock? How do we decide this is an active part? I better have it in inventory. And then in the typical life cycle, demand starts increasing and then peaks at some point and then starts diminishing. We stop reordering. We use up what may still be in inventory, and then finally, now there's just sporadic demand. Is this something I should continue stocking? That's the classic pattern, and forecasting that demands leads to 3 decision points. The first one is additions to inventory. At what point should a part be added to inventory to profitably anticipate projected customer demands? There are specific buying guidelines that are input into the dealership management system, the parts inventory portion of the DMS, and there are classic guidelines that we'll talk about later. Stocking levels. After an item is added, how many should be stocked? That's usually termed best stocking level. And if I've reached the best stocking level, when should replenishment orders be placed? That's usually given the label of best reorder point. So BSL, best stocking level, and BRP are the key to managing the turn of the inventory. Deletions from inventory. As demand declines, at what point should ordering be discontinued? When should obsolete items be deleted from inventory? The stocking levels are typical day supply. When the day supply starts fading, when when is this part obsolete? When should we begin the process of phasing it out? And if it's been sitting on the shelf for a period of time, when should I remove it? So in terms of that parts life cycle that we talked about a moment ago, this graphically illustrates the decision criteria. As we are beginning to get some demand and it starts increasing, when is the part added to inventory? And this is just constant monitoring to decide how many days supply do we need and how does that affect the best stocking level. Then we reach a peak and we start declining. At this point, we perhaps reach the automatic phase out point because a minimum movement frequency has been reached, has been triggered, and that means stop reordering and let it go on phase out. And then finally, if it's been sitting on the shelf for some period of time, when do we delete it? Now, this illustration shows the classic pattern, as it may not necessarily always look that way. Some parts may go through this life cycle more than once, and that may depend on, let me use an example. For example, it's fairly predictable that in a given model, front brake pads are replaced every 40 to 65,000 kilometers, depending on the amount of use and abuse potentially the brake system gets. And for the typical owner, this is about who drives 20 to 25,000 kilometers a year, so that's 2 to 3 years of ownership. If a new model has just been introduced and we are starting to get demand, after 2 years we start getting significant demand where we should be stocking it, and let's say it goes through that cycle again in another 2 years, so the pattern is stretched out basically because it is a replacement demand that recurs. Cross-platform applications of common parts is also an issue. More and more manufacturers use common platforms for different models, so if a new model is introduced that uses a previous model's main component, clearly that then gives overlapping life cycles. Now, we get to issue number 2, and that is discussed in the weekly stock order settings. So I'll start off with defining the specific orders. In the weekly stock order, you have a specific day during the week, and that's no limit to the amount you order, but that's your assigned day. The daily, or just in time, or supplementary order as others call it, is an order typically aimed at active parts that I usually have an inventory where perhaps I had some random demand and I don't want to wait for the weekly stock order because I'm at risk of running out of inventory in my normal movement. Maybe a wholesale account came in and bought bulk and cleaned out much of my inventory. And the third order is the EMG, emergency, or some manufacturers call it the VOR, vehicle off-road order, and that is clearly for owner is immobile, a vehicle is tied up, get that part to me quickly. These are the order types. Now, I start this slide with a lead-in paragraph that thoughtful purchasing can do more to attain the parts department's goals of customer satisfaction and profit generation than any other single departmental functions. I'll illustrate that in a moment. Now, let me move to the final, the key observation in the bottom. And a parts department cannot provide 100% availability. Any attempt to do so will ultimately result in excessively high inventory investment. That's a key observation. Research has shown that inventory investment increases exponentially as you approach 100% level of service or 100% demand filled from stock. So this is a key observation. Now, let me illustrate why thoughtful purchasing can do more to attain that the dual goals of customer satisfaction and profit satisfaction. The weekly stock order typically offers 5% stock order discount plus a 3% obsolescence allowance, but only on stock purchases. Both are lost, for daily or VUR orders. And this here illustrates the impact for a $50 part. And this is just used by way of example. My dealer net cost is $50. If I purchase that as a stock order, my stock order allowance is 5% or 250, and my obsolescence accrual allowance is 150. So for $4 combined of discounts, and the actual or real cost is $46. Now, some people argue that obsolescence accrual is not real money, it's just an allowance. Well, if you have parts to return and don't have sufficient obsolescence accrual, you pay real money in restocking charges, so view it as real money. This is a savings that should be used over time. On the emergency order side, my cost is $50, so my actual cost continues at $50. Now, what's the effect on profitability of purchasing on a stock order? You see that, let's say the sale price for this part is $75. If I had purchased it under a stock order, my actual cost is $46 and gross profit will be $29. In percentage terms, this is 61.3% is my cost of sales of the selling price, and 36.7 is my gross profit. Now, in the emergency order, my cost is the actual dealer net price of $50. That leaves me with a $25 gross profit, and the cost of sales has increased to 66.7, and my gross profit is only 33.3. So there's a 5.4% difference in gross profit. That is quite substantial, and it looks substantial just on that single part. But let me illustrate it with something more encompassing, and that makes that point more effectively. Two scenarios. We show annual, and this is annual sales, and this is a simple number. Many dealers today do $1 million worth of sales. I wanted to simplify the example. My annual P&A sales are $400,000, and scenario one is one where stock purchases of those $400,000, 40% were purchased under stock orders, 60% were purchased under non-stock orders, emergency or daily orders. And in this scenario too, 70% were purchased as stock orders, and that, by the way, is a good guideline. That's typically used, minimum 70% stock order purchases in a stock order system, and 30% on daily or emergency orders. So that translates into sales. 40% of those sales, or proportional sales of $160,000, were produced by stock order purchases, and the rest by non-stock orders, in other words, dailies and emergencies. Here it's 70%, 0.7 times 400,000, $280,000 of the sales were parts purchased under stock orders, and 120,000 not from stock orders. Now, cost of sales is the proportional number from table 2.2. In other words, for those that are, let me come back here, for those that are stock orders, 61.3% is the cost of sales percentage. For the emergency orders, 66.7 is the cost of sale percentage. And that is these percentages, 160 by the stock order percentage, 240 by the non-emergency sale percentage, etc. So we end up with a gross profit from stock orders of 61,920, from emergency orders 79,20, for a scenario gross profit of 141,840. The same applies here. Cost of sales multiplied with the stock order cost of sales percentage, with the emergency sales percentage. These are the respective gross profit portions for a scenario gross profit of 148,320. Now that's a difference, a gross profit differential of $6,480 strictly generated by the way I purchase. In other words, it's a powerful effect to avail yourself of all the discounts and the various special buying opportunities. Now, this is for a relatively small volume dealership with 400,000. I wanted to use a simple example, as I mentioned a moment ago. For the large dealer with $3 to $4 million in parts sales, purchasing practices will be a major contributor to gross and operating profit. So this is then the crux of purchasing right. How will the parts department best meet the customer satisfaction challenge of supplying the right part on time, every time, while observing optimal purchasing procedures that ensure the price paid for each and every part is the lowest available from the supplier? Now, let me move into issue 3, striking that balance between supply and demand. And let me talk briefly about supply. Every franchise has periodic back orders. That's inevitable. But generally, in industry-leading dealer networks, the manufacturer will ensure that there is predictable supply. So the issue to the dealer is more, how do we effectively track demand and translate that into inventory management practices that, to the extent practicable, allow us to fill demand from stock. Start off with observing that the typical mid-size car dealership will have somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 part numbers in inventory. Certainly the larger one may have significantly more, but for the mid-size this is an observed number. For each of these items then, the parts manager must decide how many sales, in what period of time, justifying adding that part to inventory. In other words, when has my buying guide minimum turnover been reached that I should now stock it? How many pieces of each fast-moving item must be stocked to satisfy customer demand? That's usually driven by day supply numbers to reach a best stocking level and the best reorder point with those given parameters to continue to turn the inventory. And how many weeks, months, or years are required to prove that a non-selling part should be deleted from inventory. Now, talked about supply and demand balance. I mentioned supply, that's usually quite predictable these days. Now, demand, obviously we should start with defining demand. And demand has 3 components. The first one is what is filled from dealer stock for use on retail repair orders, on warranty repair orders, and internal repair orders, and by the parts department directly through over-the-counter retail sales and wholesale sales. The second point is orders filled through emergency purchases or daily orders applied to the same account. Customer retail repair orders, warranty and internal repair orders, and wholesale and retail directly from the parts department. And then the third one, demand that could not be filled and resulted in lost sales. And there's usually 2 components to it. The first one, an out-of-stock condition on an active part. It's something I normally have in inventory, but for some reason I was out and I lost that sale. And a non-stock part. A non-stock part is a part that may be in the inventory file, but it is listed as a non-stock status code, meaning the stock order calculation does not use that part as an active part, so it's strictly there usually for tracking. So a non-stock part that I had not intended to stock, somebody wanted one and I couldn't fill the demand, and they said, don't worry about it, I'll go somewhere else. Now, some people will argue that the only true lost sale is a lost sale on an out-of-stock condition on an active part. Well, I tend to disagree with that. A non-stock part that had demand is also a demand on the inventory, and that demand, had it been filled, would have resulted in a sale. So inventory management issue 3 then, in terms of supply and demand balance, is the following. Establishment of a reliable method to produce on an ongoing basis an accurate and complete record of total demand for each and every part number in order to compile a central information source for effective inventory control. That brings me to the 4th issue of obsolescence. And obsolescence is arguably the most prevalent and most serious problem affecting parts departments. It can occur rapidly, often invisibly, and continuously. So, what is it? Well, this top part in red is a common definition. Obsolescence is any part which, when ultimately sold from inventory, does not directly contribute to profitability. I prefer that definition. There are a couple of other definitions around that define it more in terms of movement. It's a broad, all encompassing definition. In other words, it says if I can't make any money from selling the part, I shouldn't have it in stock. Now, let's assume I've bought a part and it sits there and it's been sitting there for 8 or 10 months. Well, maybe even 2 years. If I ultimately sell it, don't I make any money from that? So why, is this a problem? Well, bear with me as I develop that discussion. Obsolescence typically occurs in one of two ways. First, demand changes sufficiently that an item is no longer requested at a level that merits stocking. That's like the downside of that life cycle of a part, yet the parts department continues to hold a quantity in stock. There's some natural level of that I'll talk about in a moment that's usually experienced. And second, the part number has been changed or superseded, and because of poor or inaccurate inventory control, the item is lost to tracking, or worse, redundant parts are stocked under both part numbers. Supersession might be, or a change to a part number might be, that it was a part that had a higher than acceptable failure rate, and the vendor supplied a new one, and the manufacturer may come with a recommendation not to use the previous part anymore, so the previous part number is automatically obsolete, or it's just simply superseded because perhaps a different supplier now supplies the manufacturer, but we are not tracking it, and we end up in worst case with both of them in inventory, and both of them are not moving. Now, why is obsolescence such a problem, and particularly an insidious problem? Well, by most estimates, inventory holding costs represent 25 to 30% of a part's value just for the first year. Well, how is that possible? Well, the parts department has a facility, it has equipment, it has parts counter people and support staff, it has to turn on the lights and the heat, it has incurs a major part of the expenditure for the dealer management system, etc., etc. Well, these are all costs that have to be borne by every part on the shelf. And that represents approximately 25 to 30% of a part's value. It depends on the specific dealerships. Most people will tell you, most industry analysts will tell you, use 30% as the holding cost percentage. Now, we know from financial analysis that we'll get to that the average parts department, a good guideline of total profitability depending on the revenue mix in the department, is somewhere between 28 to 35%. So let's say it's 30%. Well, if the part sits on the shelf for a year, it sells at best at break even. The accumulated holding cost has eroded all the profit available. More importantly, the non-moving item will have occupied shelf space, more productive and tied up working capital, more productively used with regularly moving profitable parts items. Thus, every item stocked but not selling is reducing the sales movement of the entire inventory, and that in working capital efficiency terms means it depresses the return on investment. So it represents lost opportunities to improve return on investment. Now, let me look at some of the operating issues that allow us to avoid obsolescence. Avoiding and reducing obsolescence by purchasing the right items in the right quantities at the right time. In other words, have clear buying guidelines, minimum qualifying criteria before I purchase that item and bring it in stock. If it hasn't qualified, I'll use supplementary or daily orders to bring it in. in the right quantities, in other words, the right day supply, right best stocking level at the right time. Second, increasing scheduled stock orders or JIT purchases to accrue parts return benefits. So if I do end up with redundancy, I have the allowance there that I can use for an orderly return to the manufacturers without incurring extra costs. Three, immediate and thorough removal of all non-selling items. Immediate and thorough removal of all non-selling items, meaning don't let it sit there and accumulate, because over time this kind of accumulation becomes unmanageable. Accurate inventory control of additions and deletions. I guess that's the same as thorough removal. Don't let parts die on the shelf. Accurate inventory control of additions and deletions. And finally, installing rigid controls on all parts and accessories purchasing. In other words, that's saying avoid the purchase of redundant parts in the first place. The final issue is parts and core returns, headed here by, frankly, a tongue-in-cheek label of parts collectors and parts churners. This slide lists what we have seen in various industry studies. 5 to 10% of obsolescence occurs naturally each year. That's changing demand patterns and part supersessions and things of that kind. Now, normal obsolescence accrual can readily take care of the first item through orderly returns, the 5 to 10% of naturally occurring obsolescence. But studies show, and this is the most insidious, that in many dealerships, 30 to 40% of total inventory is either practically or technically obsolete. There are a couple of definitions out there of obsolescence. Usually at 6 months no sale, in the standard setting, the DMS will put something on automatic phase out, and that's usually defined now it is technically obsolete for reasons that we'll see as this course progresses. At 9 months no sales, it's usually called obsolete. It's highly improbable that it will sell within the given year, and that we know then is our definition of obsolescence, that it can't earn us any money anymore. And at 12 months no sale, as shown here, a part is deemed absolutely obsolete. So let me start with a second bullet point. If obsolescence represents 30-40% of total inventory investment, this level of obsolescence can rarely be cleaned up without significant write-offs, or if you're lucky, with a special return or authorization for a special return to the manufacturer, which may or may not be granted, because that's usually just encourages sloppy practices in many manufacturers' minds. So if there is an unusual hardship, you may get a special return. So given benchmark 3 to 5 inventory true turns, an item unsold after 1 year has eliminated 3+ times the gross profit margin on its retail value had it been replaced instead by one selling at a minimum qualifying test rate. In other words, not only if a part sits there for a year, if I sell it at the end of the year, I made no profit, but in the meantime, it's tied up that amount of working capital that could have, with normal buying, normal turnover, been sold 3 times and earned the corresponding return on that investment and profits. So at over 12 months no sale, a part is termed absolutely obsolete and should not remain on the shelf. Now, return it, scrap it, or give it away is the obvious answer to what should I do with that, and give it away is again tongue-in-cheek. But they have these parts that are absolutely obsolete have no place in your inventory. Recently, and I'm being told that this can be effective, we have seen the emergence of online parts exchange websites, which, being internet-based, dramatically expands your market for potential redundant parts, and I'm told that creates some opportunities to clear out parts that have been taken off the shelf, rather just kept in order to sell them through these exchanges. Second, and that's the parts collectors, was the obsolescence. The other parts churners is the first bullet here. At the other extremes, some dealers are returning substantial portions of gross quarterly purchases in quarterly returns. This typically happens only if there's speculative buying, and I tend to call that a cardinal sin. In other words, that's kind of the mindset, well, this is a new part, let me bring a couple of them in and see what happens. Well, that is a cardinal sin. Establish clear buying qualifying rates of minimum demand before I put it in inventory, because that kind of thing creates unnecessary returns and usually obsolescence. Now, it's an issue of balance, as is emphasized here. The second item is core returns, because the major heading in issue 5 is parts and core returns. With expanded remanufacturing programs, core returns are a growing asset management issue. Core returns was driven by rising labor costs, or I should say the remanufacturing of major assemblies was driven by rising labor costs, because overhauling, quote-unquote, of major components has largely become uneconomic at the dealer level with $100 to $200 per hour labor rate. It clearly is more economical to bring in a remanufactured assembly. Now, purchases of a remanufactured assembly typically, most manufacturers do that, typically invoice for two part numbers. First is the part number of the remanufactured assembly, and the second part number, typically the same part number with a suffix on it, is the second part number. So as you receive those two part numbers, both of those are in stock. And until, and I'm assuming the remanufactured assembly isn't used in a service job, so that's billed out through that, but the core sits there. And until it is sold back to the supplier, and that may be the manufacturer or some contract suppliers that does the remanufacturing, and returned to them, it sits in inventory. And I mentioned earlier that a typical automatic phase-out setting is 6 months no sale, so it would sit in inventory if the cores are not tracked effectively until that phase out is signaled by a control system. And in the meantime, we may have tied up a core that has a very substantial core charge. And the reason showing here 1500, that's a number was given by a given manufacturer. That's the core charge for a remanufactured transmission assembly, and that seems outrageous. Why so high? Well, there are two reasons. Return core feeds the pipeline for having cores to remanufacture, and secondly, manufacturers are concerned that cores don't float around out there and have other potential remanufacturers get into the business of competing with them. Now, that then wraps up parts and core returns inventory management number 5, implementation of an objective, consistent and rigorous process of purging inventory of redundant and unprofitable items so as to maximize return credit and to ensure optimal use of parts department space. This then is the challenge of keeping a clean and productive parts and accessories inventory. The final item in this chapter is inventory control and security, and this revolves around the issue of asset management and asset management procedures. Let me move into that topic. Veterans of the business will inevitably tell you that the primary cause of parts shortages or overages is poor work and document flow procedures. And shortages occur if things don't get invoiced, if there's inventory shrinkage or pilferage and the like. Overages, which are rare, may happen that a technician says, "Can you get me this part? I want to try if that fixes the problem," and then returns it again. In the meantime, it's charged out to the repair order. A return says, "No, that didn't fix it," and it stays charged out in the repair order. That's a classic case of how overages occur. Or there may be physical inventory count or inventory system count kind of administrative procedures. So clearly, the challenge is document all transactions, keep accurate records, limit access to the department, follow strict receiving and shipping procedures. I've always encouraged dealers when I was out in the field to think of inventory as dollar bills sitting on the shelves. So inventory security should therefore use the same procedures that, let's say, banks use to safeguard their money. Okay? Now, what are some of these procedures? Well, the first and foremost is controlled access. This is headed as a physical security checklist. I won't regurgitate each of these points, but suffice it to say, treat your parts storage area like a bank's vault, accessible only to authorized people under tightly controlled operating conditions. Don't leave entrance doors open. Don't leave the shipping receiving overhead door wide open with no person inside. Don't let technicians walk into the parts department to help themselves to parts. If some key people with key privileges, access key privileges, leave the dealership, it may be a good practice to change the locks, etc., because that's clearly a part of security. Only authorized people under tightly controlled conditions enter the parts department. In many cases, the way the parts department is laid out, it gives the parts manager directly from his office a clear overview of people milling around in the parts department, and that too is an aspect of security. That it is understood that somebody is watching and knows what's going on. Now, the next item is receipts and shipments. There are many time-honored steps to manage receipts and shipments professionally. I won't again go item by item because this and the next two slides talk about receipts and shipments. But one of the classic, and that's reflected here in item 3, separate duties between ordering merchandise and checking it in, etc. One of the classic, let me call them internal audit recommendation, is this item. It is a key to eliminating, let me call them crimes of opportunities. If the same person places the order, checks it in, and enters it and keys it into the inventory control system, there is the built-in temptation to, if the person is so inclined to change some numbers and the parts disappear. Okay? Whenever possible, then use some separate responsibilities. We move on to the next slide, and I encourage you, particularly if in the dealership you're operating or in the setting that you're operating, this is an issue, to read each of these bullets quite carefully. They're also listed in your text that you've been provided. The next one is in receiving, and I'll emphasize particularly the second item here, will call orders or special orders where somebody needs to be called. Your order is in, and other dealership pickups, which may be wholesale accounts where special orders being placed, deserve the same attention as carrier shipments. And that means, with respect to that item, an overflowing special order bin, let me call it that, is usually the result of not paying attention to customer and service department special orders, and the parts stay there. For most dealers today, a special order by a retail customer is either a significant down payment or maybe even full payment, and dealership service department repair orders, they are often the major reason why parts pile up in the special order bin. The service department orders a part when a vehicle is in for a given service and then has troubles getting the customer back in again to get it installed. So this is clearly a very significant issue. So let's make sure that special orders are turned over by managing that receipt and the delivery process effectively. Make sure that you continuously monitor the accuracy of receiving procedures and by some random checks, etc. The third item, and I'll only discuss specifically the two highlighted items in gold or brownish as they're shown here. All parts are costed or entered into the system at supplier dealer net price, regardless of price paid to maintain accurate inventory records. Now, we'll deal with this highlighted item in more detail in Chapter 3, which deals with dealership parts operations financial management, but it means that the DMS entered dealer net price is the parts cost of sales, and discounts are accounted for separately. In other words, sale minus that entered cost of sale becomes the gross profit, and only after that gross profit is calculated, discounts are an addition to gross profit in a separate account. Now, the final item, establish procedures that are appropriate for the size of dealership, the accounting and inventory control system used, personnel responsibilities, etc. This observation clearly recognizes that the larger the dealership's parts operation, the more people involved, the more rigorous associated controls need to be. Now, shipping. Shipping is parts leaving the dealership on parts trucks, and it depends on what methods are used. This is clearly a critical area where parts could easily vanish. To use a phrase that I understand was coined by a former US president in the context of geopolitics, trust but verify. That's a good philosophy in shipping. Many parts and accessories can readily be converted into cash, so have the right kinds of controls in place. And maybe in a large dealership with a lot of people moving around in the parts department, it would pay to have a video camera that monitors specific areas, particularly the back shipping and receiving area. It may mean that we do periodic random checks on what's on the parts track. Does the quantity in the box equal the quantity on the shipping slip, and things of that kind. In other words, again, how rigorous the control is probably determined by how complex the dealership's operations are. Then I get to the final topic of physical inventories. A physical inventory will be necessary at least annually to verify the bin count with the system count. And there are a number of sort of time-honored processes. Some dealers use an annual event where the parts department is shut down, maybe over a weekend, and outside inventory count agencies bring their people in and we do a major count. But certainly an annual inventory is necessary. Where audited financial statements are required, it will be mandatory. The accounting firm doing the audit would demand that. Now, there's operating procedures that help you make sure that redundant parts are returned before you do the inventory count. Make sure that all the systems are up to date. Check parts labels, print slips to counting slips, and etc. Have enough forms for the inventory taking suppliers on hand. So some form of perpetual inventory, or some people call it cycle counting, is increasingly common. Let me put that in the context of 3,000 to 5,000 part numbers that the average mid-sized dealerships would have in stock. We pick, let's say, 500 each month that we do a physical count on and reconcile to the system count. And over the period of a year, the full inventory has been counted and has been verified. I guess if you use that, as I said, it's increasingly common. Get your dealership accountant's blessing, particularly if that accountant is responsible for doing an audit annually, that this will comply with a dealership's financial reporting requirements, because you may end up doing cycle counting, and that may or may not be helpful on an ongoing basis, and then end up doing still the major physical inventory at the end of the year. Now, this wraps up our review of the core principles of parts management. The next chapter then gets into parts operations financial analysis, and I've alluded already to a couple of issues of that topic in this particular discussion.